Okay, now on to the intro to Indigenous cosmology and society in general. So I want to talk to you about a couple of things that are common to, I want to talk to you about a few things that are common to Indigenous cosmology and society prior to the arrival of Europeans in general, before I get into talking specifically about Mesoamerica. And these things, first, I want to talk to you about I want to talk to you about a couple of things that are very different from the Europeans who arrived. And this has to do with a way of thinking about the division between supernatural and natural and dualism. And I will explain both of those things. And then I want to talk to you about some characteristics that are geographical in nature, but that have implications for both cultural and what we would call religious, political development, and characteristics of Indigenous cosmology and society. And that is isolation and variation. So those are the things, and within what isolation and variation gives rise to is a kind of cosmological tension between order and disorder, which you need to understand the ideas about dualism and supernatural and natural before you can understand that. But that's a little preview. Okay, we're going to talk about the division between the supernatural and natural, and how that doesn't make sense to Indigenous people in the way that it was fundamental to European ideas of the world. And we're going to talk about dualism and what I mean by that, and how it played out in Indigenous cosmologies in a way that was quite different from the way it played out in European ways of thinking. And then we're going to talk about the geographical realities of isolation and variation, what I mean by that, and how it gave rise to particular ways of understanding the world that had to do with the sacred center and a less formed and more dangerous and disordered periphery. Those are fundamental ways that we can sort of talk in general about this extremely diverse and varied world that was Latin America before it was Latin America. But that's going to be the subject of this little clip of the lecture, and then I will go on to talking in a much more sort of fast-paced, but maybe encyclopedic in a kind of way, about the history of Mesoamerican cities, traditions, to the best of our knowledge, in a kind of summary way. And I will give you some resources for further reading about that. Okay, so back to this. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is this Western, at the time, European division of supernatural and natural that was important to Iberian Christians. It was important to Europeans in general at this time, and say that this idea did not exist for Indigenous people, for people in the Americas. The idea that the natural world, so in Europe, people really thought of, and this is again that 19th century thing that I was telling you about, it's not strange for us to think about God or things that are spiritual as being actually a part of nature. The 19th century gave us traditions that allowed us to think like that. But in the 16th century and before, that was not really the way. And it's not that that Europeans didn't use natural metaphors and that people didn't actually genuinely experience God and spiritual forces in nature. They did, certainly, and in fact, actually, much of, and we'll talk about this again later when I talk about the Iberian Christian world, much of in what you might call local religion, or local spiritual practices, looked quite pagan, and I mean that literally because that's how Europeans thought about it, meaning that it was pre-Christian in Europe. But right now, what I'm talking about is a kind of dominant culture idea that the natural world was dominated by the spirit, the supernatural world, so that there was God and the heavens, and that the natural world, which included bodies and included everything that you see, that was the creation of God, but that the natural world was, in some sense, profane, in some sense, lesser, and that the heavens were separate from that. This concept of, heaven up there, of the supernatural existing outside of the whole concept of supernatural, of there being something that is more than natural, that is stronger than natural, that is, that the miraculous existed apart from the natural world that you see, that the sacred was somehow separate from the natural world. That division really did not exist for Indigenous peoples. It seems to us, from what scholars have and anthropologists have, and Indigenous wisdom itself passed down in a very complex way, seems to show us. The natural world instead was infused with the sacred. The sacred, or what we might call the divine, was a part of the very fabric of the natural world. Divine natural or sacred natural forces might sometimes be thought of as superhuman. Humans were not always capable of, and were often not capable of, experiencing or of enacting the forces that existed in nature. And so there were forces that acted through nature that were capable of things that humans were not. But at the same time, humans were constantly in intimate relationship with these forces, with the natural world around them, and with the sacred forces that were understood to be a part of the natural world. And humans played a crucial role in the continuing function of these divine and natural forces. Okay, so this is something that's important and distinct from the way that Europeans thought about the relationship between the sacred and the profane, and the natural world and the spiritual world, and the forces beyond nature that were controlling or influencing human beings. There were moments and ways in which different aspects of the sacred, now I'm talking about the Americas again, were closer and were more imminently felt to humans, but these didn't have anything to do with being supernatural, above nature, or beyond nature, more than natural. This difference causes a great deal of difficulty in translation when Christianity comes to town, and continues to be really difficult when we try to talk about precolonial or indigenous religious concepts. So for instance, things that got translated as, once missionaries and indigenous elites and intellectuals were in deep communication, trying to understand each other, trying to recreate texts that in the initial few years had been burned, and then missionaries realized, oh crap, we really needed that information. So now we're going to try to work with these experts and indigenous elites to get them recreated. As they have this kind of dialogue and they're trying to understand each other, concepts that got translated by European Christians as the underworld or the afterlife were understood very differently to pre-colonial Americans than they were to Europeans. So in both ways, in other words, Spanish Christians understood certain things that indigenous people were describing, and they understood them to be indigenous. Europeans understood them to be talking about an underworld or an afterlife, and they thought of it as hell, and they thought of it as, hell and heaven or things like that. And also the other way around, as Indigenous people were trying to understand what in the world hell and heaven meant, they were thinking of it through their own concepts of what got translated as the underworld or afterlife or things like that. These things were not separate or not outside of the natural world. So they just were speaking, across each other in many ways. And you can still see the existence of these kinds of translated ideologies today. And we'll talk more about that later. So that's the first thing. I just in general want to share with you that the concept of a division between the natural and the supernatural was not understood in the way that it was understood by Europeans at all. And then the second characteristic that Native American religions or Native American cosmologies and societies, philosophy, however you want to talk about it, was really different is that there was an enormously different relationship to dualism than European worldviews had. So let me explain what I mean by this. So many Native American cultures and cosmologies, worldviews, were dualistic, like Christianity is. What I mean by that is that they did think in terms of opposing and opposite forces, but the dualisms were different. The particular things on either side of the divide was different, but also they had a different relationship with each other. Really, the truth is that European Christianity is not actually a true dualistic worldview, because the two sides are not equal. Good and evil are not really supposed to be equal. In Christianity at the time, in European early modern Christianity, the reigning dualism was between good and evil, God and the devil, and a whole host of things that were associated with either side of those things, including the things that we're familiar with, that have been critiqued and discussed and uncovered by critical race theory and by critical gender studies and post-colonial theory, etc., that notices that there's a reigning dualism in Western imperial cultures. We have good and bad, dark and good and bad, light and dark, man and woman, night and day. I think I'm switching up my dualisms, all those sorts of things. And that they, to a greater or lesser degree, have been in our worldview mapped onto a hierarchical notion of good and bad. So really, we're not really looking at a true dualism where you've got equal opposing forces that are a part of the world. We're really looking at a hierarchy in which we have good and bad, man and woman, day and night, heaven and hell, God and the devil, etc. And it is understood that there is this kind of consistent battle between these opposing forces. But there was a hope, at least, and a belief that good was stronger than evil, that God was stronger than the devil, and that there was this eschatological way of understanding history and the future, which was that eventually good would win out. Not everybody would survive that battle, but that eventually the end of days would bring about a triumph of the forces of good. Okay, so in pre-colonial cosmology, that was not the way that it was understood. In fact, one of the really difficult translation problems was that in most Indigenous languages, there was actually not really a word for good or bad. Instead, it was a true dualism in which the organizing division of the universe were things like order and disorder, moderation and excess, creation and destruction, and yes, woman and man, dark and light, night and day, moon and sun, a whole host of things. But and some of these divisions were somewhat hierarchical. There were, and we'll talk more about that too, the smaller states and the smaller societal organizations often tended to be more partnership models, and the larger empires there, we can call them patriarchal, and there were hierarchical divisions between slaves and enslaved people and free people, and between different classes of human beings that we might think of as economic and political. Gender differences that were hierarchical in particular ways. But in a very real sense, however, the world was organized between opposing forces that were meant to always be opposing and to ultimately needed to stay in balance. That the idea of good conquering evil, first of all, really wasn't a notion of that, but you wouldn't want order to conquer disorder. You wouldn't want chaos or order to reign. You wouldn't want the day to win over the night, etc. In most of pre-colonial cosmology, that was not a goal. The idea was that the cosmos, by necessity, included excess and moderation, creation and destruction, order and disorder, and that human and natural history, humans were a part of natural history, and the passing of time was organized in cycles that included all of these forces. And the goal, and humans had an enormous role in this, and so that the stories of creation and destruction were organized in cyclical eras, sometimes called suns, sometimes called earths, but they were, or worlds. But the idea was that there had been multiple eras where things had been created, and then something got out of balance and it was destroyed. And that the world that we were in, the era that we were in, or that they were in, was one in which human beings had a fundamental role in maintaining the balance between the struggle, the pushing against each other of these opposing forces, and that human beings had to play a role to manage these opposing forces, to keep them in balance. So the goal was not for one side to win or the other. Basically, in many traditions or many cosmologies in the Americas before Europeans arrived, it seemed that there was an understanding that the constant struggle of these equal forces, the sun and the moon, the night and the day, cold and hot, chaos and order, etc., that there was this constant struggle, and that the struggle did drain the earth, the land itself, of life force. That there were these cosmic and cosmological forces that you could see in the stars and you could see in these heavenly bodies, that the earth was sort of stuck in the middle of in a certain kind of way, and it drained the life force of the earth. And human beings were required, through devotional practices, through the letting of blood, through human sacrifice, or at least blood sacrifice. Often sacrifice was not necessarily taking the life. There was human sacrifice, and I'll talk about that when I talk about some of the large states in Mesoamerica. But much more common was just simply blood sacrifice, meaning piercing your ears and putting cloth through it, and then giving the blood to the earth, or cutting yourself and letting blood into a bowl and giving it to the earth. The idea was that human blood replenished the earth. So this is one example, but in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of ritualistic ways, and in and not just in things that we might think of as ritualistic practices, but also in daily practices like sweeping. Sweeping was a particularly important way that people managed the barrier between chaos and order, for instance. And there's a whole lot of other things, naming practices, ways that people related to certain days of the week and certain days of the month versus ways you related to other days of the month and days of the week that were more aligned with order or disorder. human beings behaving in particular ways, sometimes ritualistic ways, sometimes seemingly ordinary ways, but that carried really significant power, was a crucial part that the natural world stayed aligned, stayed in order. Disorder and excess and chaos and destruction were thought of as dangerous. It's not that those forces were, exactly the same as order, but they were a key part of the sacred. They were cultivated and celebrated in particular moments. That was part of how these opposing forces were managed. It wasn't only that we tried to contain forces of destruction and chaos and lean into forces of order. That was not the case. They were cultivated and celebrated at key times, even as they were also feared. Great care had to be taken when dealing with such dangerous forces, and there were specific times to revel in them and to call them forward. The article that you read by Inga Clendenin seems to suggest that in the context of at least Mexica religion, or Mexica ritual, that the sacred was even more present in these dangerous moments, in the moments of destruction and disorder and chaos. She suggests that some of these rituals, the presence of sacred was also the presence of terror. And it may be true that this may be more true for high religious ceremonies in the Aztec Empire than it was in local traditions and practices like sweeping and other kinds of more ritualistic practices. It may also be that we have the impression that this is the case because Spanish witnesses were more concerned with the apparent celebration of things that Christianity thought of as evil and diabolical. Christianity would have looked at this celebration of chaos and disorder and thought of it as, and did think of it as, Satan worship. Did think of it as people being in the thrall of satanic forces, literally. So they would have written a lot about it, and they would have sensationalized it. So that is also part of what we need to keep in mind. But what I want to, emphasize in these words just about the sacred and the supernatural and about dualism is that in the pre-colonial world in the Americas, the sacred was immediate and imminent and everywhere. It was not divided into good and bad, and nor was it separate from natural or nature or natural forces. Rather, the sacred was also natural. The sacred contained things like serenity and comfort and calm and order, peace, beauty, etc., and tranquility, as well as chaos and excess and ugliness and fear and destruction, etc. That was all part of the sacred, and it was all part of the natural world. And it was neither good nor bad. It was a part of what was and what necessarily needed to be maintained. In fact, the cosmos required disciplined, careful, and respectful tending of these opposing forces, and that humans had a key role in this tending. Okay. Now I want to talk to you about another couple of common things that sort of gives you a general sense of the cultural and cosmological and human landscape in relationship to geography and to pre-colonial social and what we might call religious formation. But you know what? I think I'm actually going to divide it up even further than I said I was going to, because this is already long. So I'm going to end this, and then I'm going to I'll do a part two.